Okay. So what I want people to be thinking about today is sort of preparing for the peer review exercise that we're going to be doing in January, February for some of you, and I think there was another one in April, May. Is that the plan, Erin? I'm trying to remember.
Yeah, we're going to schedule those, yes.
Yeah, so so today I'm going to just kind of talk about how to think about the National Institutes of Health, how to navigate it, how to communicate with it, as well as to talk about how peer review works and how grants are reviewed. At the end of this slide deck, there is a link to a YouTube video, which is basically a mock study section. It's basically an idealized study section interaction so that you can get an idea of sort of how people function in the study section. And it's produced by NIH. A lot of the scientists on it are actually very famous scientists. And it really is very true to life about how the actual grant review meeting goes. So I would urge everybody to watch that video when you have a chance. It really, I think you'll find it quite informative as you're thinking about how to put your application together in relationship to peer review. Also, this is essentially how I'm going to run the peer review exercises that are going to be coming up in the spring or in the winter to spring. Okay. All right. So that I just sort of want to walk you through the structure of the National Institutes of Health and how to essentially interact with such a huge bureaucracy. It is the largest source of biomedical research funding in the world, and it's basically dealing with billions and billions of dollars. And while the infrastructure can be complex and kind of hard to figure out how to get your fingers into understanding it, it really does have kind of a set structure that if you understand that structure, you can usually find the people you need to help you with questions and so forth. Okay. So with that, the first thing, which I think everybody here has had some interaction with because you were successful in putting together a biosketch for an MRDA, and that is a website that's called ERA Commons. Now, ERA Commons is your online portal for everything that NIH does to communicate with grantees and reviewers and everything else. That when you log into ERA Commons, there's a whole bunch of links. One of them is a link called Status, which essentially tells you everything that you need to know about every single grant you have ever submitted to the NIH. I have data going in there going back 20 years. And it tells you, what was submitted, what was its score. That portal is where you obtain your grant reviews. It's where you see the funding status. It's also the site that we log into when we're viewing and scoring grant applications. It's also the site where when you, let's say, got a 3-year grant and you have to do a progress report every year, you go through ERA Commons to interface with that as well. Like I said, I'm pretty sure you all have ERA Commons IDs. This is the same ID you will have through your entire career. There are some people who get these Commons IDs when they did undergraduate research, and they will have those theoretically for the next 30 years. At least that's the plan. Now, I think everybody here has already done this, but as you talk to colleagues coming through, if they are thinking about applying for a grant or even an MRDA, the very first thing they have to do is obtain that ID, and because that can sometimes take some significant time. There is a training website for how to navigate through ERA Commons. And if you're not aware of all of its features, you might want to go ahead and take some time and watch that video. Now, just kind of overall, NIH is a huge place. Like I said, it handles billions and billions of dollars of research funding. It's really very often you're not dealing with NIH as a full organism because all of its pieces are relatively autonomous to each other. And each autonomous section has quite a different mission and even also has a lot of institute specific rules. There's 27 institutes and centers, as well as the Office of the Director, which is the global NIH director. Now, almost all direct grant making, which is what you guys are going to be dealing with, is done by institutes. They each have direct budget lines. That how institutes do their grant making is also very, very different. And how they parse out their money is very different between institutes. The first separation is the idea of the intramural program and the extramural division. Even within a single institute, the intramural division, which is the stuff that's happening on the NIH campus, and the extramural division, which is what's happening out at universities, often are very different from each other. They often don't even overlap in scope fully. It's not at all unusual for an institute to have a different intramural and extramural mission. Now, there's also centers and offices that have even more diverse measures. They often have limited grant-making power, but they can have some, like the National Center for Complementary and Integrated Health. They do some grant-making, but they certainly do not have the amount of funding or anything else that an institute might have. Okay, so as you're thinking about applying to the NIH, first thing you really have to figure out is which part of NIH is most likely to fund you. Now, there are some really obvious connections, like the National Eye Institute is mostly going to fund you if you study something related to eyeballs or vision. National Cancer Institute is cancer, diabetes, digestive diseases. There's also can be clear. But there is often overlap in missions, and this can include things like diabetic retinopathy, retinoblastoma, which is a cancer of the eye, a diabetic kidney disease. That's pretty clear because that's in diabetes and kidney diseases. But what if it's diabetic lung disease? That might not be necessarily obvious. However, sometimes a grant will be assigned to two different institutes who can sometimes share the funding, or sometimes that they can both consider it for funding and they will decide which institute ends up funding something. Now, there's also institutes that do biomedical research that it might not be disease or tissue specific. A big one is the National Institute of General Medical Sciences, as well as the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences. These are things that might be funding you if you're not clearly within a particular institute's mission. Now, one thing that can be especially if you are in one of these in-between zones, is how do you find that institute that could be interested in funding your work? Of course, talk to your mentors. They have the best ideas and the best knowledge of your field. However, another good way is and this is a good idea anyway, really think about who's doing work that NIH is funding in your area of interest. That it's really good to have an idea of what sorts of projects NIH is funding now and who's doing them. Some of this has to do with, say, maybe the NIH portfolio is already completely full up on the kind of stuff you're going to be doing, and it might be harder to get some traction in that area. It also could be that it's going to be really obvious that there's nobody funded in your area. Now, that could be because nobody's been submitting, or it could be it's an area NIH isn't interested in, and that's something that you want to try to figure out. Now, there's another website if you want to figure out what institute NIH is working with. That's called NIH Reporter, and this is the link to it. So if you go to the NIH Reporter website, you'll get a page that looks a lot like this, and it allows you to look up funding on all sorts of different parameters. Let's say you're interested in finding everybody who might have a K award at your institution. You can type in organization, and further down on the sheet, there's actually a place where you can put in K award. So you can find every single active K award at your institutional employer. Or let's say you're interested in everybody who's studying, let's say, cataract development, which is my field of research. And through this text search box, I could just type in cataract, and every single piece of NIH funding that mentions cataract as part of its justification will pop up on this web search. You can also search just active projects or people who have money right now, or you can search projects back going 20 years about everything NIH has ever funded in a particular area. So this is an idea of a keyword search that was probably done on something called posterior capsular opacification, which is a disease that I study. And this is just a list of the 5 grants that were given in this case, fiscal year 2016, on posterior capsular opacification. And this is a mixture of some clinical grants, or some research grants, as well as a company that has a award for developing new materials for that could help prevent this disease. Now, one of the things that's pretty obvious here is admin IC. They all say NEI. That's the National Eye Institute. Makes sense. It's an eye disease. National Institute's going to be funding that. Now, what you can do then is it allows you to actually click on the project titles here, and it allows you to drill down more to see exactly what they're doing. So if you clicked on this one at the bottom here, the role of MMPs in TGF-beta-induced cataract, you can get a lot of information about this particular grant. You can get the text of the abstract, so you get a general idea what they're doing, the public health relevance, what budget line this is funded out of, and then a whole bunch of key terms. Now, another thing that you're going to want to be thinking about is not just what institute you're interested in, but what type of grant you should be applying to. Now, NIH has a vast number of award types, and this link will give you access to those award types. There's different flavors and different codes. R-type grants are just research grants broadly defined. This can include R21s, which are for innovative research, R03s, which are small research grants, R01s, which are the large research grants, R34s, which are for planning clinical trials. And then there's also the K grants, which are the career training development grants. And there's a very large variety of K grants, each of which is targeting a different set of investigators here. And this includes postdoc to independence transitions, research experiences for career independence, protective salary support for newly independent investigators. K07s are just for cancer prevention, and so forth and so on. Now, the thing that's really important to note, though, is that you might find the perfect grant mechanism. It's like, yes, fits me to the T. But one thing to realize is that not all institutes fund all grant mechanisms. So you want to make sure that once you've found the institute that funds your type of science, you want to make sure what funding mechanisms just that institute is pursuing. Just as an example, the National Eye Institute does not fund R03 grants, but other institutes do. And while you might have a project that's eye-related that would fit in the R03 mechanism, you're out of luck because that's not what the Eye Institute will fund. So figuring out all these details really matters, because if you apply to an R03 for the National Eye Institute, you'll put in all that effort to submit that grant, and it'll be bounced back to you because they don't fund that mechanism. Okay. So I will take a small break and just want to make sure if anybody has any questions to date about how to identify an institute, how to identify a grant mechanism. You can feel free to either break in or type into the chat. But if you don't have a question, I'll just move on. Okay. So with that, I will go back to where we were then. So once you have the institute identified, then you need to figure out the so-called portfolio that funds it. All institutes have a large big picture mission, but they also then break that big picture mission into different programs where the program is basically a budget line item that is funding research in a particular area or subfield. So I'll use the National Eye Institute as an example. They have a program for retinal disease. They have a program for neurophysiology of vision. They have a program for diseases of the anterior segment of the eye. And each one of these funding missions has somebody called a program official or a PO in charge of that. The PO is the first line decision maker about whether you're going to be funded. They're the people who basically read the recommendations of the grant reviewers, read what your grant is about, and they overlay this over what grants are currently funded in the area, the overall funding priorities of the institute and the program. And they balance the reviews with how much money is going to this research area, to how much money they want to be spending across the research areas. And they're the one who actually decides first cut whether your grant's going to get funded or not. Now, for this reason, it's generally super helpful for the program official in charge of your work. Excuse me. I'm going to see if I get some really good real quick. Okay, so but it's usually super helpful to identify the person who is in charge of this decision making and have them know your name. Now, you guys are all young investigators. The program official isn't going to have met you because they funded your grant before. But you still want them to be aware of your existence, know what you're doing, and they can also often give you advice about whether or not your research area is something they're interested in funding, is within their mission, and so forth. Now, this is also figuring out who's making that decision is super important. If you're responding instead of to the open call saying all K awards or R awards, there are things called requests for applications. Requests for applications are essentially, the NIH says we really want to fund research in a particular area, and we're not getting enough grants through the regular mechanisms addressing the problems in a particular area. A really big one that's happened recently are grants having to do with the opioid crisis. That NIH has gotten a huge influx of money on research onto opioid addiction, and they weren't getting enough grants that addressed issues of opioid addiction. For this reason, there are specific funding mechanisms and calls that are saying, please, please, please send us grants on opioid addiction. Now, the requests for applications articulate the scope of what they want to be funding. That one thing that's useful in the request for applications, though, there's always a contact person who's usually the program officer in charge of that request for applications. That it would be extremely helpful to talk to that person to make sure you're interpreting what they are looking for in relationship to what you're doing. Now, what I would recommend is that you want to have those contacts about 2 months out from the grant deadline, preferably earlier. Because let's say you talk to a program official and they say, well, we're not really interested in funding stuff in your precise idea, but we are interested in funding things in a related idea. That can be super helpful information. Now, when you're looking at NIH from the outside, it can be kind of daunting to figure out who the program officials are you should be talking to. However, NIH Reporter can really help you with this. So I'll go back to my example here, which is this grant, the role of MMPs in TGF-beta-induced cataract formation. So I did my NIH Reporter search. I found a grant from somebody doing research in an area similar to mine. And when I look at this, I can see the contact PI. This is the scientist. I can also see the program official information. And in this case, the program official is Humam Araj. And that you can actually click and you can get Humam Araj's email address at the NIH. So there's your contact information related to the area, the research area, or the budget person who's in charge of funding research in this particular area. And one thing that you can check is to see if all grants in a similar area are handled by the same program official. And in fact, all 5 of the grants that are listed are in fact all handled by Humam Araj. He is the program official who handles this set of funding priorities related to eye disease. Okay, so you've figured out who your program official is that you want to be talking to. So how do you contact them? Now, you can often find their phone number on the internet. However, I would recommend that you don't cold call them. Because if you cold call them, they don't know who you are, they don't know your research area, and you're asking them to make decisions or opinions on the fly about your grant area or you or anything. What I would recommend is that you send them an email requesting an appointment for a phone call to discuss potential grant applications. The email should include who you are and preferably send your NIH biosketch, as well as some information about the grant you are considering. A really great thing to send is your biosketch and your developed specific aims page. And you can offer some potential times you're going to be available for a phone call, but be flexible for the program officer's convenience because you're asking them for a favor. So that's probably the most viable way to get a conversation with the program officer. However, you can also often meet program officers at major conferences in your field that NIH staff in your area attend. And you can talk to people who are your mentors about which conferences in the field actually have the NIH program officers attend. Most NIH program officers do try to make it to the major conferences in the area they're in charge of so that they can see what's up and coming. They can see what sort of impact and new things that their grantees are doing. They can see what the field is finding exciting. And if you are going to these conferences, you can just ask for a one-on-one appointment at that venue. And program officers are usually perfectly happy to sit down with you one-on-one at these conferences and talk about it. Sometimes program officers will even be willing to set up a face-to-face appointment at their offices in Bethesda to discuss your grant application. If they are willing to for that face-to-face appointment, we are certainly close enough to drive up to NIH to meet in person. However, not all program officers are open to that, and if that's the case, fine, just do it by a phone call. Okay, so the things to expect of this conversation that you remember having maybe 1 to 2 months prior to the grant submission deadline. In my experience, this highly depends on the program officer. I think some, and even maybe most, are very serious and committed to building their grant portfolios, making sure that they have a pipeline of scientists from early career to senior who are doing work in the research area of focus. And many program officers are very interested in mentoring new investigators and helping them navigate what sorts of areas NIH wants to be funded. However, I will tell you it does depend on the individual. I have met program officers that are not supportive and not good mentors. They're just interested in pushing money around, and this conversation may not be that useful. But I would say the vast majority of the time, speaking of the program officer, can be really helpful. They could tell you that the area fits in their program and grant mechanism, and they can be encouraging you to apply. They could say that, oh, no, this isn't actually what I do. You need to be talking to this other program officer. And they'll send you somewhere else, and that's fine as well. Or they could basically say that your approaches aren't going to fly based on how the study section is reviewing this sort of work, and they can advise you to do a complete rework of the planned research under those circumstances. But it's much better to know these things a couple months before you apply than after the fact, after you've gotten a grant rejection. Now, at this point, I've talked about the institute, I've talked about the program officer. But something that you need to understand is that that program officers seldom handle grant review. They sometimes do, but in general, grants are reviewed by a completely, not just different person than the program officer. They're often not even reviewed by the institute that you're seeking funding from. Instead, there's actually an entire center of the NIH called the Center for Scientific Review that handles grant reviews globally. Now, this is the point that nearly all NIH grant applications enter the NIH system. They review 70+% of all grant applications that come in. Now, the exceptions are notable, especially for this group of people who tend to be early stage investigators. And this includes some K awards, those training grants, group project or U awards, and some special requests for applications and contracts. So these are the RFAs that I mentioned, where the program is deciding that we do not have enough applications in a particular area, and we want special grants to be coming in. Now, how does that review process work? Now, the first thing that happens is that your grant goes into the Center of Scientific Review. They basically first parse it into a general similar type of grants. So just as an example, there's an integrated review group for neuroscience very broadly. Now, neuroscience will include not just the central nervous system, it also includes peripheral nervous system. It includes the sensory systems such as eye and hearing and so forth. So this means that, like, the hearing grants get funded by deafness and communications disorders, but they're coming into that same integrated review group with the eye grants, which are funded by the National Eye Institute. Now, the integrated review group is basically a portfolio of different study sections. Study sections are the group of scientists that review grants in a particular research area. And in most cases, this is something called a standing study section. Standing study sections are basically groups of scientists that have been impaneled that each person on that study section will be reviewing all the grants in the area for anywhere from a 3 to 5 year period, and that they have a term and then they rotate off when they're done. It's in general really critical to try to figure out potentially which study section your grant is likely to be reviewed by. And this just has to do with grant writing. That when you write a grant, you want to make sure you can intrigue your audience. You're not giving them information they already know, but you're providing them with information they might not know to understand the significance of your grant. Thus, understanding the type of person or even the names and research areas of people who might be reviewing your grant is super helpful when it comes to actually writing your grant when you're going forward. Now, how do you figure out what study section your grant is? Going back to NIH Reporter is the way to go. So this is actually from one of my grants, that if you look down, there's this thing called Other Information. Other information includes study section. And in this case, this grant was reviewed by the study section, Biology of the Visual System. Now, once you know the study section, and since this was reviewed by what's called a standing study section, that you will find further information by clicking on that. And here we clicked on that link, we see the study section, the committee name, SRO, that's Scientific Review Officer. This is the NIH official who's in charge of running the study section. And then there's a membership roster. These are the people who are permanently assigned on the study section. So if you click on membership roster, well, first that they have the permanent roster. The permanent roster people are scientists in the extramural program. They're field experts, and they almost always have received significant prior NIH funding in the past. They usually have a lot of review experience, which means that they've been asked to serve on these study sections on an ad hoc basis. So they might be brought in just to review a few grants, but they won't come back year after year, but they do a good job, so they're asked to be permanent. They first get nominated to serve by current study section members or the scientific review officer. That once somebody is in line to be nominated to be on the study section, the scientific review officer starts calling the recognized leaders in the field who are well funded to see if that person has a good reputation and would be supported as a potential study section member. Now, one thing to note, only one permanent study section member is allowed per institution. This is to make sure that, let's say, the Washington University ophthalmology department is not overrepresented so that they can set together an old boys network within their institution. Now, the terms of service can range from 4 to 6 years. And remember, there's 3 study section meetings a year. If they go to all 3 meetings a year, they might have a 4-year term. If they go to 2 of the 3 a year, they'll have a 6-year term. So the study section membership is relatively stable. Those are people that can be counted on to likely be there when your grant is being reviewed. Now you can click on the membership roster and it will tell you the person's name. This number in brackets is the year that their term ends. So this person would go off on 2017, while this person is going to be on the panel until summer of 2020. This person's on until summer of 2021, and so forth. So this gives you the opportunity to then do literature searches on every single person on the study section to give yourself an idea of their research areas and their research interests. And this is important because this is the audience that is going to be reviewing your grant. Okay, so I always use the permanent rosters to allow me to target my grant introduction and even the significant sections towards the reviewer expertise. Because that you don't want to introduce material that they don't know, but you don't want to admit material that they might not know. Now, if some of the study section members are pretty close to your area, you generally want to make sure you reference pertinent papers that they have published to show that you're aware of their work and that how your work fits into the larger picture. But if you do decide to reference papers written by your study section members, you have to make sure you get the science correct. I have been on NIH panels where somebody clearly saw that I was on the panel and they basically referenced something that I wrote and they misunderstood it. I've also had cases where my work was kind of gratuitously referenced, that it had nothing to do with the topic of the grant, but they referenced me because I was a study section member. Keep in mind the study section members are smart, that this pandering will not get you anywhere. That said, if the study section member has clearly made an impact on the science in the field, you definitely want to acknowledge that you're aware of that. Now, another thing that you can use the permanent roster for is to identify any potential reviewers who are on the permanent panel, but you have reason to believe are biased against you for non-scientific reasons. If there's somebody that you think might have a bias against you, you can request that they be excluded from the review of your grant. Now, I would encourage you to use this highly sparingly. This is not for somebody who you've had a scientific disagreement with. It's somebody who has taken that scientific disagreement to inappropriate places. I have used this exclusion request once because of a permanent study section member who basically acted very inappropriately at a conference publicly. However, that it really, really is generally something that you want to use very, very sparingly. Okay. Now, one thing that you have to understand, though, is just because somebody isn't on the permanent roster doesn't mean that you won't have other people reviewing your grants. And these are ad hoc members. Ad hoc members are people who are not on the permanent roster, but will be on the roster of people who review your grant. These are brought in often to fill a hole in the expertise of a standing study section. Just as an example, for instance, let's say you are studying a disease and you're submitting something that's a highly computational problem. It's not unusual for no members of the study section to have computational expertise. So they might bring in, as an ad hoc basis, somebody who has computational expertise or expertise in a particular method or technique where there is no expertise on the standing study section. Ad hoc members can also be folks that are nominated to be permanent study section members or who are being tried out to see if they do their reviews on time at high quality, so that they basically show the skills that they want in a good study section member. There's also a early career reviewer program in which, and I would actually urge everybody on this call to look into this. It's basically newly independent investigators who have never held R01 funding, have the opportunity to sit a round or two on a NIH study section. They might only be given 1 or 2 grants to review, but they can see the entire process. They will have done a real review, and they can participate in the discussion of other grants. If you can get chosen for the early career reviewer program, it is super helpful to give you a different perspective on the reviewers of a grant stop becoming them. You start to understand where the reviewers are coming from when they're looking at your grant. All right, so with that, I will take a pause. Do people have any questions in the sense of, seems like that at least one person found the idea of how do you get through the NIH website and find the people you need has been helpful, but do you have any questions up to this point before I go into the study section? Procedures and how review's done? Okay. So at this point, you have identified your institute. You've spoken to your program officer. You've got your grant written and submitted. It's been assigned to a study section, and basically that puts it in the inbox of the scientific review officer, who's the NIH official who's charged with the peer review process. What that person will do is read probably your specific aims page and try to match that specific aims page with 3 reviewers, for a minimum of 3, sometimes 4 reviewers of your application. Now, at the time of assignment, the identity of the 3 reviewers is blinded to each other. And these reviewers are expected to fully review your grant independently without any consultation or discussion with anybody else. So they score the grant and they write critiques, which then get uploaded to a central system. Now, anywhere between 3 weeks, and these reviews, written reviews, are due 3 days to a week prior to the meeting. The computer then tabulates all the scores, averages the scores for the 3 reviewers of the grant, and then ranks all the grants in the study section from the very best grants in the study section to the worst score. So in NIH world, a 1 is great and a 9 is terrible. Now, the next thing that happens is that if it's going to a standard study section, the grants, in a standard study section usually sees about 100 grants in a cycle. That, let's say there's 100 grants, they'll be broken into the top 50% and the bottom 50% of scores. The top 50% are grants that are going to be openly discussed at the study section meeting. The bottom 50% are those that are going to be, people call it not discussed, people call it triaged. These are grants that, since they're not in the top half of grants, are unlikely to be funded, and that it just takes a lot of time to discuss poor grants, so they're just not discussed. Now, it used to be that the grants were ranked from best to worst, and that the first grant that is discussed during the study section meeting would be the very, very best primarily scored grant. Now, I was just on a study section last week where my understanding is that there's a new change in policy, and they're now taking the discussed grants and they're mixing up, they're randomizing their order of discussion. Now, this is how they used to do it 20 years ago. Then they went for discussing from best to worst. This is subject to change. But after the 50% of grants with the highest scores have been discussed, a motion is then made to make the rest not discussed. Now, the thing to understand is that any study section member can pull a grant that initial scores were in the lower half onto the discussion list. Also, the scientific review officer will insist that grants in the bottom half get discussed if there is a very, very broad score discrepancy. maybe one reviewer thought this was the best grant they've ever read. The other reviewer gave it a terrible score. And so that the average put it in the bottom half. Or sometimes it's a reviewer wants to discuss the grant publicly, but has ideas that they find compelling. Now, they have as each grant is discussed, sometimes points are brought out that weren't put into the initial written comments. Sometimes a reviewer changes their mind because their first impression was more positive or negative than it was after they had certain parts of the grant explained to them by other study section members. If their opinion changes in the week after the study section meeting, they can revise their initial critiques. And then after the critiques are done, the scientific review officer and the study section chair sit down and they collaborate on writing something called the summary statement. So this is basically, there's a lot of points that are brought up in the oral discussion in front of the study section, and the summary statement is essentially a summary of everything being discussed at the meeting. So what goes to the applicant and the program officer are the numerical scores, as well as, which is a overall impact score, and then the criteria subscores, the summary statement, which is the summary of the discussion, and the written critiques from the study section member. Now, something to understand is, what does impact score mean? Impact score is the numerical score your grant will get. It is a very important number because it is a big push about whether the grant will be funded or not. Now, that I pulled the definitions from the NIH reviewer information for fellowships and career awards. And this is the overall impact score. And it's the likelihood that the proposed training or career development will enhance the candidate's potential for a productive, independent scientific research career in a health-related field. If you notice for F and K awards, this actually isn't talking about the research per se, it's talking about the training. Now, the research plan is important, but the research plan is important only because if you're following a crappy research plan, you're not getting good training. But overall, that the fellowship in Ks are based on the training potential, not necessarily on the impact that the research being done will have on the field. In contrast, in our grant, the impact score is the impact that the research being done will have on the field. Okay. Now, at this point, the grant's been reviewed, it's scored. The next question is, how is funding decided? Now, the first thing has to do with the raw score. So the raw score is the number you get back with your grant. And the raw scores from that study section are combined with all scores from that meeting, as well as the 2 prior meetings. So if this is an October study section meeting, these scores are combined with the scores that came from the June meeting, as well as the February meeting. And a percentile is set up. So the percentile is essentially what percentage of grants got a better score than you got on that study section. So usually, since study sections see between 90 and 100 grants a time, that it's out of 300 grants that were reviewed over that past year, how good is your score in percentages? And this is done this way to even out differences in average scores that are due to study sections, different study section cultures. It also evens out the reality that sometimes a single meeting might get a lot of good grants, another meeting might get a lot of bad grants. Now, the program officer then takes the scores and really isn't looking at the numerical score so much, but at the percentile score and the reviews for all grants assigned, and looks at budget and funding priorities set for their grant portfolio. And what they do is that they break the grants that are coming in into a definitely fund, a fund at partial budget duration, fund if money available, and a do not fund list. Now, one thing you have to understand is that this determination is not just based on your grant score. It's based on your career stage. So early stage investigators get a boost in this process. What other funding the investigator has. If you already have some major high-end funding, you generally need to get a higher score to get yet another grant than if you have no funding at all. What other grants in this area are already funded? Can be super important. In my field a few years ago, it turned out that a lot of people who are studying herpes virus infections in the eye, like the top scientists, all sent their grants into the same study section on the same cycle. And that essentially all the high scores on that study section in that round were all studying herpes virus infections of the eye. However, that study section sees a wide variety of eye diseases, and the program officer could not spend all of their budget just funding herpes virus infections of the eye. So there were a number of high-scoring grants that were passed over for funding for grants that got worse scores simply because they have to have a balanced portfolio of a wide range of science in their subject area. Also, this is the subjective opinion of the program officer counts. So if that program officer has met you, talked to you, thinks you're up-and-coming scientist doing exciting things, they will definitely put the finger on the scale for you. It might move you from fund if money available to funded partial budget or duration. That can be a super important assessment. So this is why meeting with your program officer and getting a good opinion can be really important. Now, keep in mind, though, that the program officer makes initial recommendations. They don't do the final decision. Now, NIH's peer review system is actually a two-tier peer review system. There is the first round of review, which I've already talked about. Then the program officer makes funding recommendations. And then these funding recommendations are reviewed by something called the Scientific Council. And the Scientific Council are very senior extramural investigators who then review the grants that are being funded and not funded. In most cases, the Scientific Council is a rubber stamp on what the program officer is saying, as well as the study section. However, the Scientific Council is a second round of peer review, so that they can point out grants which should or shouldn't be funded based on information the program officer may not have. Maybe it's a super hot area that did not get a super high score, but the Scientific Council can make a very strong case to have a grant be moved from fund if money is necessary to definitely fund and so forth. After the grants go through the Scientific Council, the budget determinations are then repeated, and then there's a portfolio of funding that then gets signed off by the institute leadership. That's probably in most cases a formality, but they cannot tell you whether you have funding or not until the institute leadership signs off on your grant. Okay. Now, I've talked to you about, a lot of places to contact the program officer. However, it is sometimes important to contact the program officer after you've gotten your scores. And one thing is that once you get your score, to find out whether it's in the ballpark or funding. Often that's sort of ambiguous. Like, let's say you get your score back and you get a 16th percentile, which means that your grant is in the top 16% of those submitted. well, it might not be completely clear whether that grant's going to be funded or not. And that's important because you have the opportunity, if it's not going to be funded, you can revise the application and resubmit it. And you don't want to revise and resubmit if it's definitely going to get funded. You also want to talk to the program officer once they get the written reviews back so that you can get some insight on how to revise that application or even whether to resubmit. So if your grant is in the bottom half, there's a lot of times when your grant should be reworked so extensively, you should submit as a new application, not as a revised version of the old application. Having this discussion can also be helpful if your grant was discussed but did not score high, because often the the program officers listen to the discussion. They call into the studies section meeting and listen to what's being said. They can also, sometimes if you're, let's say, on the borderline, you can let it drop what your professional situation is. For instance, I know of a situation of a faculty member whose grant was on the funding bubble, and that whether or not they got tenure or not would depend on whether that grant was funded because of the timing. And they talked to their program officer about it, and not just did the program officer manage to fund it, they managed to fund it a full cycle early, so that this person would have a funded R01 grant on their CV when they were being considered for tenure. Also, if you had new key preliminary data, but it got published in a really hot journal after the deadline for announcing it, that can also help. Like, let's say your paper got published in Nature Genetics, that's the preliminary data for the grant, and it's on the bubble. You tell your program officer that this submitted grant got the preliminary data got published in a really hot journal. They're going to feel more motivated to fund you if they can, if it's on the bubble about whether or not they're going to fund it or not. And that's simply because the program officer is trying to make sure that top research in the field is being funded so that there's progress in the field. Having your paper published in a hot journal is one way that program officer can feel confident that the work is really important. Another thing that you can consider is that, let's say you have a grant that was on the bubble, they didn't fund it, and it's like late August. It doesn't hurt to contact that program officer to see if maybe they have some end of year money. They might be willing to fund it at this point. And another thing is that sometimes the NIGMS will dual fund a grant with that of an institute. And this is something to talk to your program officer about back in January, February. That's where these dual funding requests come out. And just make it to the program officer's attention that you're working in an idea state. Often they can make arrangements with NIGMS to potentially get the grant funded, even if the institute can't fund it. Okay. So with all of this, I think the take-home message is that it can be super helpful to understand which humans actually are going to be looking at your grant, how your grant is being reviewed, because you can use that information to position your grant for success. And definitely make sure your NIH program officer knows who you are. You don't want the first time they ever see your name to be when your grant is on their desk and they're trying to make a decision whether or not to fund it or not. Okay, so that's all I'm going to actually present. This is the YouTube link, though, for the example NIH study section deliberations. This is the general format we're going to do with the peer review exercises that are coming up. So please take some time to watch this so you know what to expect when you're reviewing your colleagues' grants as we're going forward. Okay.
Melinda, we did have a chat question.
Yep, I just saw it. Okay, so if there's a very senior researcher who has an R01 in your area of interest and is doing very similar but not the same thing as your proposal, will NIH see that and think that they already have funding this area, or do they allow for competition and complementary research? I think it depends. I think that you need to make sure it's really clear how your work is unique. Competition is okay, but if it's clear, but just imagine you're a brand new assistant professor trying to get started in an area, and you're competing with somebody who, let's say, has 4 postdocs and a very established research program. You're probably going to lose that competition. However, if you're looking at the same problem from a different perspective, or you are potentially trying to explore a different hypothesis about what could be going on, that can be a plus. That you're basically looking at it. But you definitely don't want to be in a situation where the perception will be that you're a young person trying to go head to head with somebody who's just going to be rolled over. So, like just as an example, like there were 5 grants from the NIH studying the disease that I study. And that's actually kind of seems like a low number, but a lot of people in my field actually are international. That all 5 of us are studying the same disease. Sometimes we're studying complementary aspects, but honestly, we're all studying things from different perspectives. We're studying the disease at different entry points. So we really aren't technically overlapping with each other in our research areas. So definitely if you read the abstract and it sounds like exactly what you're proposing, make sure you're writing in such a way that your work is unique and distinguishable. I would say this also, like, when you're doing job applications or anything, I'm on a faculty search committee right now, and that's a discussion for every single new investigator, is what this person's planning to do unique or novel or innovative compared to what's already being done in the field. And that's probably something you should be asking yourself anyway. Is your work actually innovative and unique compared to what's already being done, or are you really just going to be a me too? Hopefully that answers that question. Anybody else have anything else on the chat? I'm not seeing. Oops. Yep. Thanks. Okay. So if there's no other questions, I will close this down for today. We'll be getting together to start trying to do these peer exercises in the winter, and just stay tuned, and Erin will be contacting you about how we're going to set that up. And I wish everybody happy holidays.